2019 Tolkien biopic has always been very confusing to me. I first watched it when I knew next to nothing about Tolkien's life, and I thought it was fine. But as I learned more about his life from other resources, I began to wonder why this Tolkien biopic had left me feeling so meh. For years, I tried to figure out if it was just the incorrect or misrepresented facts, or if it was the insertion of CGI dragons into one of history's most brutally violent battles, but I was never quite able to put my finger on it. But recently I saw the 2023 Christopher Nolan biopic, Oppenheimer, which is one of the best biopics and probably one of the best films that I've ever seen. And seeing what I liked about that movie allowed me to begin to determine what I found so off-putting about Tolkien's biopic. So today we are going to be pulling apart the 2019 Tolkien film and figuring out what it got right, what it got wrong, and what it means to tell the story of a person's life. But before we get into that, let's have a quick word from today's sponsor. I am so very pleased to announce that this video has been sponsored by Skillshare. Skillshare is an online learning community that lets you explore thousands of classes, covering subjects from graphic design and marketing all the way to crafting and music. As I've settled into my new house, I've loved exploring classes like this: Home Interior Design for More Joy, Cultivating Happiness Through Decor. This class goes through the different environments of your home, teaching you how to make your spaces more impactful and joyful. It's been a great tool in helping me figure out how to have the hobbitiest home possible. If you would like to unlock your creativity and learn something new, Skillshare is offering you a 1-month free trial if you use the link in my description. You're definitely not going to want to miss the wealth of classes that Skillshare has to offer, so make sure you guys check this one out. The first 1,000 people to use the link in my description will get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare, so get on it. Huge thanks to Skillshare for supporting me and what I do on this channel, and let's get back to the video. So let's start by talking about what this movie got right, or at the very least, what I liked. And visually, it is a beautiful film. The costumes are, mostly historically accurate, and you can tell that a lot of care and attention got put into the camera work. It's a visually beautiful film. And factually, they got it sort of right. All of the characters have the correct names, things happen in the geographical location that they're supposed to for the most part. But to be honest, things like that feel sort of like the bare minimum. I would even say that one of the central themes of the film, Tolkien's relationship to his schoolmates, was handled fairly well. The group met at school in Birmingham and consisted primarily, with, some variation, of Tolkien, Geoffrey Box-Smith, Christopher Wiseman, and Robert Gilson. They called themselves the Tea Club Barovian Society, also known as the TCBS, and they would meet up, usually over tea, to talk about art, poetry, and literature, and share their own work with each other. Though the TCBS remained in contact through most of their schooling, 2 of its primary members would be lost in the First World War, and the film does a pretty capable job of showing how these relationships and the loss of them affected Tolkien and his works. But the major place that this film falls flat is in his relationships outside of school. And it all boils down to one essential change. The filmmakers chose to include nothing but a very superficial mention of Tolkien's Catholic faith. And of course I could hypothesize on their motives behind this choice, but I think what's really important is what changes this creates within the story. Tolkien had been raised religious, but it wasn't until after his father's death, when he was living with his mother and his younger brother, that their religion really came into the limelight. Mabel Tolkien, his mother, had been struggling financially since the death of her husband. She received some financial assistance from her family, but it was very, very minimal, so she had to work very hard to keep her small family afloat. And within this struggle, she found comfort in her religion. She had long since been a pretty devout Christian, taking the boys to Anglican church every single Sunday, but eventually they found themselves going to a different church, a Catholic church, and Mabel made the choice to convert to Catholicism. In his extensive biography on Tolkien's life, Humphrey Carpenter claims that immediately the wrath of their family fell upon them. Mabel's family, who were firm Unitarians and Anglicans, were outright hostile towards her after she had made this decision, and they cut off all financial and emotional support permanently. Still, Mabel remained unwavering in this decision, bringing up Tolkien and his brother Hilary in Catholicism. But this conflict is distinctly missing from the film. It shows the family falling on hard times, being forced to move to the city with the help of a Catholic priest, Father Francis, but the only reason given for this change is just pretty generic money troubles. And this is technically true. Mabel had to work herself to the bone in order to provide for her children without any financial support from her family, but the only real reason given for this in the movie is, I guess, the death of her husband. Thus, when Mabel dies suddenly in the film, young Tolkien is left lamenting the fact that they were poor, believing that their poverty is the reason that his mother died. Meanwhile, in real life, Tolkien took this blow in a completely different way. He explicitly believed that his mother had been left to die destitute by their family because they resented her for converting to Catholicism. In later writings, he outright calls Mabel a martyr, someone who is killed for what they believe in, saying that she killed herself with labor and trouble to ensure us keeping the faith. The sudden trauma of losing his mother in such a way caused Tolkien to latch onto his Catholic faith with a deeply emotional ferocity. Carpenter proposes that after she died, Tolkien's religion took the place of his affections that she had previously occupied. His mother had been his safe space, his first educator, his comforter. And now, in her absence, he clung to the one thing of her that he had left. So I hope you can already see that by avoiding touchy religious topics, the Tolkien biopic has veered completely off the course of what Tolkien's true emotional core was. Fervent religious devotion has been replaced with lukewarm concerns about money. This all comes to a head when we get to his future wife, Edith. And I'm pretty okay with how the movie portrays the early days of their relationship. It accurately follows what we know to be true, that they were two deeply lonely orphans that found comfort in each other. Issues arise when we come to the conflict in their relationship. On an external level, Tolkien and Edith were up against two things. First of all, their ages. They were 3 years apart, with Tolkien only 16 and Edith 19, and Edith was also Anglican. These issues were compounded by the fact that Edith was distracting Tolkien from his studies. All of his life, his mother, his guardian Father Francis, and years of expensive schooling had prepared him for one thing: to be admitted on scholarship to Oxford University. But now, a brand new secret relationship with an Anglican woman 3 years his senior was distracting Tolkien from his studies and causing him to fail exams. Father Francis resolutely banned Tolkien from seeing Edith until he turned 21, and after Tolkien had realized the workaround, he was also banned from writing to her. Now, the film chooses not to address their differing ages or religious backgrounds, and so Father Francis is left with very little ground to stand on. He has to make his argument simply on the fact that Tolkien is being distracted, and once again brings it around to money. Father Francis explains that he wishes that Tolkien could have the same luxuries that other boys do, essentially implying that Tolkien is too poor to get into college with bad grades, and that that's why he needs to focus. This is technically probably true, but once again, removing the emotional core of these characters' journey keeps us from understanding the true nature of Father Francis's choices. But even internally, within the relationship between Tolkien and Edith, their conflicts are likewise muddied. Without religion or age to contend with, they are once again left arguing over poverty. Tolkien seems plagued by the fact that he doesn't have enough money to give Edith the life that she deserves. This all bubbles to the surface in a scene in which Tolkien is too poor to pay for tickets to get them into the opera. He and Edith are forced to listen through the back doors of the opera hall as Tolkien claims that his lack of funds is shameful. He tells Edith, "I'm not going to live like that, and neither should you." When prompted, he explains that it's not about the tickets. It's about not losing the people that you love. He says that he is still haunted by his mother's death, something that Tolkien thinks he could have prevented if he only had the funds. And look, I'm not going to try and say that the real-life Tolkien never struggled or worried about money. Of course he did. But there is little indication in either his biography or his own personal writings that concerns about wealth were one of the central conflicts of his life. This is an invention by the movie, and its presence, as well as this blatant avoidance of discussing Tolkien's religion, keeps us from diving into the true complexities of Tolkien and Edith's relationship. In the film, things carry out much like they would in a storybook. After being separated by the needless cruelty of Father Francis, Edith sends a letter to Tolkien while he's at school, explaining that she is engaged to be married to a different man. This coincides perfectly with the beginning of World War I, and Tolkien immediately heading off for the front. But before he can board his ship, Edith appears, wanting to speak to Tolkien. Tolkien romances her and sort of apologizes for all the things that he did to her, and of course they share a beautifully romantic kiss. Once Tolkien is sent home from the war due to trench fever, Edith is there waiting for him. They profess their love and care for each other, and they are married. Upon being separated, Tolkien did indeed pine over Edith for a very long time. It seemed to occupy his mind constantly, keeping him from forming any other real relationships with other women. Instead, he latched onto his schoolmates and classmates, forming very close brotherly bonds with them. When Edith's letter arrived notifying Tolkien that she was engaged, it came with some pretty heavy implications that if Tolkien said the word, she would abandon her fiancé for him. Tolkien, of course, still adored her, and so they reunited, and the engagement was broken off with very little fuss. But this was far from the swelling music, fairy tale romantic moment of the film. First off, it didn't happen as Tolkien was leaving for war. It happened when he was still in school. In fact, after the war had already started, whilst Tolkien was putting off joining, and they were married before he was ever deployed onto the battlefield. So rather than being torn physically apart by the effects of the war, Edith and Tolkien simply struggled with what it was like to finally be reunited. You see, the two of them had been apart for years in entirely different company. Edith had spent her time with other women, teaching children to play piano and keeping the house, and Tolkien had spent it studying and partying, avoiding the contact of women as much as possible. And in Tolkien's eyes, through the crucible of time apart, Edith had become something out of a story. She was small and sweet and precious, and his nickname for her was Little One. He had visions of her far off in the forest dancing, intangible, beautiful, and unreachable. But now that they were together, his visions of a fair and distant elven maid were clashing with the very real, very human Edith Tolkien. They argued fairly often and sometimes explosively. In order to marry Tolkien, Edith had to give up her career as a pianist, her family, and her community. And even with all that she had given up, Tolkien seemed incapable of seeing her as she truly was. He did not encourage her to pursue any intellectual activity, partly because he did not consider it to be a necessary part of her role as wife and mother, and partly because his attitude to her in courtship was not associated with his own intellectual life. To her, he showed a side of his personality quite different from that perceived by his male friends. She could see that one side of him only came alive when he was in the company of men of his own kind. It seemed that spending so long in male-dominated spaces had left Tolkien struggling to communicate with Edith as an equal, and this issue would continue to plague them for the rest of their marriage. And of course, it was a particular issue when it came to religion. At Tolkien's insistence, Edith had converted from Anglicanism to Catholicism before their marriage, but she never really seemed to feel at home there. She'd received a lackluster education in the faith in the first place, and she found practices like confessing one's sins to a priest to be very uncomfortable. At first, she simply stopped attending church services, but after 10 years of marriage, and once they'd had a couple of kids, Edith began to resent Tolkien's fervent dedication to his faith and his insistence to raise the children the same way. Their lack of communication really came to a head here, as Tolkien seemed unable to discuss her feelings with her in a rational manner. Certainly not with the lucidity he demonstrated in his theological arguments with C.S. Lewis. To Edith, he presented only his emotional attachment to religion, of which he had little understanding. Eventually, it would appear that they worked this out, with Edith, not participating in, but supporting Tolkien in his religion. But these sorts of conflicts were very integral and important to their relationship. Edith had traded her whole life, everything that she had built up, to be with her essentially high school sweetheart. Tolkien, meanwhile, idolized Edith in a way that made it difficult for him to see her as an intellectual or emotional equal. And I don't want this to sound like I'm trying to paint a portrait of Tolkien as a woman-hating villain. I'm just trying to explain that he was a very complex man with very confusing habits and motivations. I'm trying to make it clear that the 2019 Tolkien biopic made little to no efforts to show the true range of the man that Tolkien was. And maybe you can just write this off and just say, oh, well, it's a movie, it's a biopic. They cover what they can, and for the rest, they smudge the details around to make the whole story a little bit prettier. And as someone who usually finds all of these issues in every biopic that I see, I would be inclined to agree, except that one movie has changed my mind on the genre forever. The 2023 film Oppenheimer tells the story of J. Robert Oppenheimer, called the father of the atomic bomb. He was an American theoretical physicist who, during World War II, worked on the Manhattan Project, the American government-run project that led to the development of the first nuclear bomb. Now, if you haven't seen this movie, I'm not really going to spoil things, but you should go and watch it. It is 3 hours of just delicious dialogue and character building, and to be entirely honest, it has restored my faith in the modern film industry. The visuals are stunning, the practical effects are jaw-dropping, and the performances are career-defining. But what really stuck with me, and has haunted me ever since I saw the movie, was the way that they built their central character. You see, J. Robert Oppenheimer exists in a fascinating place in the cultural context. A lot of people know his name, but it will almost always be followed up by his moniker, the father of the atomic bomb. His name will forever be irrevocably linked to that invention, the nuclear bomb that has shaped the modern socio-political landscape. He is a historical figure that will always loom heavily over any discussions of war, innovation, and the human tendency towards destruction. But beneath all of this grandiosity, this history, this title, was a man, and the film, miraculously, never manages to lose that central thread. Throughout it, we see Oppenheimer grappling with everything that a human being would. His own political beliefs, his interpersonal relationships, the troubling machinations of his own mind, and in his case, what it is like to have every eye in the world on him. We see the way that he defined his creation and the way that it defined him from the beginning of his career to its catastrophic end. And this kind of care, this genius level character writing, is severely lacking from the 2019 Tolkien biopic. In many ways, the stories of Tolkien and Oppenheimer are parallel. They are very complicated men whose life work would become so much larger than they ever could have dreamed. However, the Tolkien film caters to this. By limiting the story to only the very first part of Tolkien's life, filmgoers are left to see every single detail presented by the movie as leading up to The Lord of the Rings. His mother tells him stories of dragons and warlocks. The TCBS calls themselves a fellowship. Edith is the exemplary elven maiden, and he sees knights, horses, and dragons in the blood-soaked trenches of the First World War. All of the story is focused on showing us how The Lord of the Rings capped off Tolkien's life. But the problem is that it didn't. He had a lot of life outside of his stories. He had a codependence on his religion, deeply fraught relationships with those around him. He struggled with depression, with his work ethic, with finding his place in the world, and all of these struggles didn't just happen so that he could write The Lord of the Rings. Oppenheimer shows us that it is possible to write a film about a man who created something that changed the world without just having it be about that thing. Of course, The Lord of the Rings and the nuclear bomb are hardly on the exact same level of things that forever altered the course of human history, but it is undeniable that Tolkien's biopic is not about Tolkien in the same way that Oppenheimer's is about him. In the introduction to Tolkien's biography, Humphrey Carpenter quotes him as saying, "One of my strongest opinions is that the investigation of an author's biography is an entirely vain and false approach to his works." And Tolkien's biopic is, ironically, the perfect example of why he believed this. If we look at authors only as the authors of the things that we created, if we look at Tolkien as only the father of fantasy or Oppenheimer only as the father of the bomb, we lose their humanity. We lose who they were in what they gave us. And when biopics decide to lose themselves in sentimentality to present the man that we all want to see rather than the man who was there, they do a serious disservice. Oppenheimer presents us with a man who is so overwhelmingly human that despite our efforts, we will never truly understand him. Tolkien 2019's lackluster effort tries to turn Tolkien into something digestible. They flatten out the real man until he's a shadow of who he truly was. Immensely complex, intensely intelligent, truly emotional, and human. Now, I do think it is probably possible to create a biopic of Tolkien that represented him more accurately to who he was. If you couldn't guess, I find his life and the person that he was truly fascinating, and a film that was fully able to encompass and explore these more difficult topics would definitely be worth watching. But I want to know what you guys think. Do you think that a biopic like this is actually worth making? Or should we let Tolkien lie as it seems he wanted us to? I did already sort of cover this topic in a video way long ago where I talk about how we use resources about Tolkien's life to figure out who he truly was. So if you are interested in that, go ahead and check it out. I do figure that most of you have already seen Oppenheimer, and if you have, I am dying to know what you think. I literally cannot stop bringing this movie up to everyone in my life, and I think it's starting to annoy them, but I just haven't had a movie make me think and feel as much as this movie has in a very long time. If you do want to talk to me about Oppenheimer or about Tolkien 2019, you should go ahead and check out my Patreon, which is linked in the description. There you can join my private Discord where you can talk to me and other Tolkien fans about what you thought about the movie. That first tier is just $2 a month. It is a super fun community and a great way to support the continuing of this channel. Beyond that, just liking and subscribing help out the channel immensely, and I am so grateful to you for watching to this point of the video. Thank you so much for hanging out with me this week, and I hope that you have a very happy, hobbity day.